Hello and welcome back to the Cloudology channel. Um, so today's topic is common tools that developers are asked about on job interviews or resumes or job descriptions, for example. So picture this: picture you're a full stack, back end, front end software developer, and you see on job requirements that AWS experience is required or something like that. But you're a little confused because you never worked in AWS to a capacity of like a cloud engineer, for example. So you might be wondering, what the heck do they mean? First off, they probably don't know what they mean, to be quite frank. AWS is kind of like a buzzword or, something that recruiters use to see what candidates are going to tell them, basically. But there are a couple tools that you as a developer should probably know, or at least get somewhat familiar with, right? So I'm going to list a couple of them. I'm going to show a couple of them actually on the consoles. Probably the most commonly used one I'm going to show on the console. Um, That way we can get a good idea of what, if you're an aspiring developer or already a developer and some jobs are asking you for AWS experience, basically asking what the heck does that mean? So typically what that means, so some typical tools that developers are going to interact with on the cloud are going to be things like AWS S3, which is object storage. Um, and I'll show you that in a little bit later. I actually have it pulled up here, and I have some objects in there so you guys can kind of see what it is. And I have the equivalent in Google, which is Google Cloud Storage. Same deal, same object type storage. Um, and I'll kind of go over what that is because I think that's the one that's mostly going to be sought after if you're a software developer, because you're going to be interacting with S3 buckets. Typically, if you're a software developer, like obviously as a cloud engineer, S3 is like crucial. Like I haven't been in a place that hasn't used some version of cloud storage like that. So obviously for a cloud engineer, it's important, but also for a developer, jobs might ask you to interact with it. So we'll just get a brief overview of what that looks like. I mean, I can do a deep dive into S3, but I think that's kind of like unnecessary for the developer side of things. So on Google, it's called Google Cloud Storage, which I said. AWS is called S3. And on Azure, it's called Azure Blob Storage. They all basically do the same thing. There's some differences here and there, but for the most part, those are your three cloud storage options between the three different clouds, right? Next one you're going to look at is AWS Lambda, which is Cloud Functions, essentially. So basically, what AWS Lambda is essentially, so if you want to run, I've talked about this in a previous video a little bit, but if you want to run, some type of like reoccurring function to, I don't know, like make updates to an application or maybe like do backups, for example. Like if you wanted to do like some type of like backup or some type of like synchronization, and it's just like literally a one-off function that needs to be ran like on a schedule or something like that. So AWS has Lambda. Google has Cloud Functions, does the same thing, can be written in like Python or PowerShell. Typically, it's Python. I think some of them let you do Ruby. I don't remember off the top of my head. And then you have Azure Automation, which I think that primarily works with PowerShell, if I remember correctly from the first job I had, which Azure Automation, I don't like Azure, but Azure Automation is pretty cool because you can write basically these PowerShell scripts and you can get really in depth on scheduling them. And I think the user interface for that is a little bit easier than like for Lambda functions, for example. There's not as much like mystery to Azure Automation, in my opinion. There's a lot of other cool things you can do with it as well. Um, Another thing that developers need to have some familiarity with is virtual machines. So EC2 for AWS, or for Google, Google Compute Engine. So my last video, like Terraform usage, last Wednesday's video, Um, we use Google Compute Engine to deploy like a really basic like application, right? Super basic, just an overview of what Terraform is and how it works, right? So Amazon has EC2, which is Elastic Compute instances. Google has Google Compute Engine, and then Azure has just Azure VMs. So in some way, as a developer, you're eventually going to have to interact with them, whether it to be like, to get an IP address of a machine so you can like connect to it and see what's going on with your application, or maybe routing DNS, or something like that, right? Um, Another tool is going to be basically like container runtime slash like easy deployment type deals. So something like AWS Elastic Beanstalk, for example. Essentially, you can take like a container image or like a static like HTML file, and it basically cuts out all of the complexity from like doing an EC2 and like doing the security groups and stuff like that. So if you run it in Elastic Beanstalk, it essentially like takes a container, for example, from Docker Hub. You give it a Docker Hub URL or a container image, and it builds an image based off of, or builds your application based off of that image, and then deploys it to a live environment, gives it a live URL, and load balances it for you. So that's Elastic Beanstalk on AWS. Cloud Run does something very, very similar. As a matter of fact, it's almost identical. And then I think Azure has App Service. I think that's what it's called in Azure, which I've never used before, so I can't really speak to if it's good or not. I have used both Elastic Beanstalk and Cloud Run. Both are very good. Obviously, I bias towards Google because they make things pretty easy, and the user interface is pretty nice for Google in general. Sorry, AWS Maxis. I'm a Google Maxi. Another one you guys should be familiar with as a developer are IDEs that are cloud based, which I haven't actually been to a place that utilizes these, but I have a feeling they're going to be a little bit more popular because they're a lot cheaper to run versus sending new candidates a laptop. You can just give them an AWS environment or a Google environment or an Azure environment to work out of, basically. So for AWS, it's called AWS Developer Tools. For Google, it's called Cloud Code, I believe. And basically, all it is an IDE packaged inside of a cloud environment. So you basically just log into it, and you have essentially what is like your VS Code integrated development environment, and you can. I believe the connections to everything, all the other services are made a lot easier as well. I don't know. I've never actually used one. Um, I might want to just investigate that like on a live stream one day because I think that's pretty cool to have like your own IDE that's cloud based, and you don't have to run anything on your computer. You're not really dependent on what computer you're on, which is pretty nice. Um, Another service that you developers should be relatively familiar with. Again, I think this is more on the cloud engineer side or like the DevOps side, is going to be domain name services. So like Route 53 for Amazon, for example. Um, and essentially what that is, basically you're assigning these VMs don't have like, public endpoints unless you open them up to the public, right? So they don't have like an IP address that's accessible usually. Um, or like a load balancer doesn't have an IP address that's accessible. Or it does, but it's just an IP address, and you want to map it to like a domain name, like www.mywebsite.com. You know what I mean? So that's kind of where the DNS stuff comes into play. It gives your DNS essentially obviously stands for domain name service, and it basically assigns an easy to remember name to that instance or load balancer or whatever the case may be. So you don't have to access your site through a like IP address, and you can use an actual domain name like google.com or youtube.com, whatever the case may be. And so your site will actually have an actual name to it. So for AWS, it's Route 53. For Google Cloud, it's called Cloud DNS, and for Azure, it's called Azure DNS. So those are the main tools that I was kind of like um, that I would think that a developer would need to use to some capacity, or at least have a surface level understanding of what that stuff is and how it works. Now, I want to go over um, AWS S3 because I think that is going to be pretty crucial for developers. So basically, we can see here we have the AWS screen pulled up. Store and retrieve any amount of data from anywhere. So you can kind of think of it like a database almost. Typically, you can store pretty large files in S3 now, but typically this should be used for like um, I don't know, maybe different assets for a website, for example, like different pictures, like static images on websites and stuff like that, or log data. A lot of people use log data, and I think I actually have a bucket on AWS. So remember how we were doing Terraform last Wednesday? Basically, I had what's called Terraform state, and that state was stored locally on my machine. Well, obviously, that's a problem when you're on a team, right? Because um, you want people to be able to recognize that state from their computer, right? When they're applying object or applying resources and stuff like that. There needs to be a central area where state is held. Well, that's where Amazon S3 or Google Cloud Storage comes into play. Because you can see here, this Terraform bucket actually holds my terraform.tf state file, which is right here, which this, you can hide this from the internet. I believe this one actually is private, if I remember correctly. It's been a long time since I used this, but if I open the bucket, it just looks like this. Like it's basically an empty state. There's really nothing there. Shows me the Terraform version I was using, which this must have been quite a while ago because that is not even in the first full version yet. That's 0.12. Anyway, I digress. So this is what S3 buckets kind of look like. This is what they're for. It's just to store like random stuff involving applications. Like it can be pretty much anything. Like, so let me switch over to my Google cloud storage, right? So this, for example, I used to store media for a website that I have. So if I look at something here, literally I have GIFs stored in here. This one's 34 megabytes, and I have it stored in this Google storage bucket. And this is just for basically a website that I helped create. Right? It's you can only allow like authenticated users to actually get this asset. Like this is just a GIF, so it's not really that big of a deal. So I think this is actually public. So, oh, it's not public. Okay, so this website, the only thing that has access to this is the actual website that I have hosted, which is pretty cool. Another reason why I like Google is they can literally like only allow access from certain DNS names to access things, which is I think is pretty cool. Um, it's a little weird because the API key kind of has to be public, so that's like not great in my opinion. But when you manage it like Google does, it's not that big of a deal. So this, for example, is just some buckets that are that I just have in here, or some objects that I have in here that are just storing static data. Now, if we look at a different project, I can show you an example of like the container runtime. Um, if we go to Cloud Run, for example, you can see I have a bunch of different Cloud Run um, instances here, right? So I have my other business's website that is, you know, not very frequently trafficked, but essentially all it does is um, it pulls a an image from Artifact Registry. So here it's pulling a Docker image basically, and then it's running it uh, on Cloud Run. And all the scaling happens automatically for you. It's already load balanced. I have like a public URL, which is not actually the URL. I actually have a domain name for it. But so this is an example of like Cloud Run, and I don't think I have anything for Route 53. Route 53. Yeah, I don't think so. So basically, it's just scalable DNS. Yeah, I don't have anything for Route 53. I don't think I have anything at all. I might have something for uh Google. Let's see. For Cloud DNS. Data cannot be loaded. Cool. Probably because I don't have. Oh, yeah, it's not enabled. What about this project? Nope. Okay, so I don't have anything for Cloud DNS. No problem. But that's kind of the overview of the different tools, and obviously, like stuff like EC2 instances or compute uh, instances. Obviously, so we've got some instances here. This is actually from a Kubernetes course that I was taking a little while ago. Not sure why these are still here. I haven't deleted them yet, but this is just a compute instance. So, for example, if I wanted to get this internal IP address or maybe SSH into this instance, I'm going to have to interact with this in some way. So, when recruiters ask you, do you have any experience with, AWS or GCP as a software developer, as like a front end, back end, or full stack engineer? This is primarily what they're asking for. They're not exactly asking for you to be like, oh, do you know Terraform and Ansible and like monitoring and logging and stuff like that. Most of the time, they don't really care too much about that. Um, this is more along the lines of what they're actually looking for, right? Just you have some knowledge of like clicking through the console and like interacting with some of these services. Good evening, says Christian Soto. Good evening, Christian Soto. Thank you for tuning into the stream. Hope you're learning something today. Um, so we can do. Let's look at Lambda. I know I don't have anything for Lambda, but we can look at it, and literally you can see the tagline there was uh, run code without thinking about servers. So basically, this kind of spins up a server that kind of runs it for you. It sets up an environment for you to run, and you can use, oh, look, you can use a Node runtime, you can use .NET, you can use Golang, Java, Python, Ruby. So yeah, so you can run quite a bit of different languages in this. So you can use a blueprint. We can do so modify HTTP response header, get S3 objects. So you can retrieve some data from S3. So where these things interact with each other, and you know send that data somewhere or do something with that data. Um, Create a microservice that interacts with a DDB DynamoDB table. So that's pretty cool. Book details of a visit using Amazon Lex. That's pretty, dude. We need to mess with this a little bit. Run an external process using Node.js. I kind of want to mess with this. I'll do this in another video because this I've never really like dug into Lambda other than like basic usage for like work and stuff. So like stopping servers or like cleaning up resources after you take them down and stuff like that. So that might be something pretty cool to look into. Now we also have stuff like dev tools, developer tools. I don't know if we have that actually. That might be a different service. I know it exists. So we have code commit. That might be something they ask you for too. So like instead of using GitHub for your source code, code commit is basically GitHub hosted by AWS. So you still use the same Git commands to upload to AWS. Typically, you're not really going to use that unless like GitHub is not specifically allowed for whatever reason. Like if you work in the government space and you're doing like a FedRAMP type deal, sometimes they don't allow GitHub to actually run your code from or to pull your code from. So you have to use something that's authorized, which AWS Code Commit is authorized for FedRAMP. So FedRAMP moderate, I believe it is. So there's some other tools. And then you have, so I showed you guys Cloud Run, Lambda. I showed you guys S3. I think I do have, I wonder if I still have my Elastic Beanstalk stuff here. Elastic Beanstalk, run and manage web apps. I don't. Applications, change history. Yeah, it's probably, oh wait, I do. I do have one. I do have Pen. This is my app from boot camp, dude. I'm going down memory lane right here. So this, like, it's not even running. It just shows me application versions, I guess. So this was like a previously deployed thing that is no longer deployed. I remember I was the one responsible for deploying this whole application. So maybe that's why I transitioned into cloud. Um, so yeah, basically this allows you to run an app from a container image, or I believe you can do it with some like very lightweight code. Like if you're just running like a portfolio website, I think you can do it with Elastic Beanstalk and just hosting like the static HTML file. So that's might be something to look into if you want to like deploy your own websites. It's kind of an easy way to do it. Same deal with like Cloud Run over here. Like I'm a huge fan of Cloud Run. I might actually take like a basically a tutorial on how to use Cloud Run, like just directly from the console, because it's very easy to, basically manage everything with your application. So that's why I really like, as long as you know how to use Docker, and I can even go over like a Docker tutorial because I absolutely love Docker. It makes deploying apps extremely easy, and everything's in one environment, right? So that's a video I think for another day, because that's a little bit more involved. Um, dude, I'm thinking of videos constantly. Every time I do a stream, I'm like, oh, I can do a video about that. I just got to remember to write them down after I'm done. But anyway, I hope this gave a little bit of insight into what you need as a developer to answer that question of like, do you have AWS experience? That's the biggest question I get, is like, what does that mean? It's such a generic and general term, and quite honestly, the person that wrote that job description probably doesn't even know what it entails either. So typically when they ask you that question, this is what they mean. They mean, can you interact with the console? Can you get an S3 bucket? Can you send data to an S3 bucket from your backend? Stuff like that. Like they're not asking like, oh, can you deploy like an EC2 instance and set up the entire networking with like Terraform? You know what I mean? They're not asking you stuff like that as a developer. That's a different job entirely. They might be asking for that if they're like a startup because they want somebody that knows both. I've definitely been approached by jobs that are like, hey, like we need a backend engineer. I'm like, cool. Like I know Node like backend pretty well. Like I can probably do Flash too if you ask me to. And they're like, okay, cool. Like we also need someone that's really familiar with like AWS because they kind of have to deploy it. And I'm like, well, that's like two different jobs. But I mean, sure, why not? Um, but I hope that this gave you some insight into what these people mean by AWS experience as a software developer. So this is typically what they're talking about when they're talking about AWS experience or GCP experience or God help you Azure experience. So I hope that was insightful. You guys have a great night. I'll be back probably this Saturday with another laid back stream. I've got a good topic for that one. So please tune into that. And then back to the technical stuff next Wednesday. You guys have a great night. Thanks.